Hello, we are here in Pavilion of Turkey talking about the future of childhood in Vardiya #2. Now we have Segolene Pruvot with us from European Alternatives. Segolene has been one of the tutors of this workshop, so it's really a pleasure to now have finally the time to also look at the amazing work they are doing at European Alternatives. For me, to come across European Alternatives was a quite important moment also. It was during the Italian elections. There was a great article actually in Al Jazeera. Yeah, that's actually how I came to know you guys. And I think some of the themes that are important for this workshop is a discussion of future and actually identities. A lot of the work that we have done in some ways touches on that, and I think that's also at the core of European Alternatives work. So it will be a pleasure to hear more. Thank you already in advance.
Okay, I will move with the computer. Hi. So I heard you had a discussion on the role of architects as decision maker, political decision maker, and I was kind of interested to know what is your conception of your role in the future as members of society, and what you're trying to bring along as members of society with your practice in the future. I don't know if anyone would like to elaborate on that. Like, have you thought about it? What is your ideal? I mean, we all know that ideals are not always taking shape. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the great things about studying architecture is seeing how it overlaps with different disciplines, whether it's urban studies, sociology, philosophy, art. And I think as architects, we have this skill to sort of look at things more broadly, and that could be applied to certain social issues. And hopefully, I mean, there's also the path of just like designing things and out of context and in a very isolated way. But I think in the future, since many disciplines are converging, architecture could be influential in certain policies that could affect the future of our society as a member of it.
Anyone else has a position as like future role in society as an architect? Yeah.
Does it work? Okay. Although I see the high-tech as a solution of most of our problems, even without the high-tech, I mean, without the technology itself, which will develop increasingly in the next coming ages, I see the architecture as the not the direct solution, but the indirect solution of the most of the social problems of today's. So I believe it could be. I mean, I can maybe be part of some of the social problem solution as an architect in the future.
Okay. Any other comments or reactions on the role of architects?
I have to say that I sometimes have difficulties with this very broad perspective of the role of an architect, and I feel that often when I hear talks of architects, I mean, there's almost nothing which they don't consider their responsibility, and I would, in this case, like to ask the question, like, what is not your responsibility as an architect because it stretches that far. I think at the same time, as a citizen, like we have a responsibility. So in this case, I think when I think about spatial justice or social justice, I think these are not questions of the inclination of a wall, of the thickness of a slab, but this is so, let's say, deeply rooted that I guess in this point I would rather see a city planner at the municipality in charge of this realizing justice on an urban scale rather than an architect. And then else, as a citizen, of course, everyone is kind of in charge of participating at this question.
Actually, Matthias started my opinion already. I think we all overrate architects, and I mean, even we create a space, we design it, and we say the people who come here will feel in that way. It will change the environment that way, and blah blah. It never does. I don't mean never, but the impacts of the architects are not that strong. I think they us like to think ourselves as God, but it's not how it works. So I think we should step back and consider that we are just creating some spaces that only has limited impacts, not the endless possibilities.
Just to add up to some of the comments that I've made that I agree with, I think the scale of architecture and the things that we deal with in terms of like the physical scale of it keeps getting extremely large. And we don't, like, I don't think we're provided in the education level that actually that gives us the tools to understand that scale. So I think perhaps in the future, architecture can become more the definition of an architect can be broader. But on the other hand, I think that the architect needs to have subcategories in terms of what kind of an architect you are. So I don't think it's personally my place to talk about urban issues because I am not an urban planner and I don't have that type of education. And I think like that needs to be defined and separated. Like we can't just like talk about these types of things in a broad sense.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I think that you mentioned some things I wanted to go to. The question of working in silos, like so each of us within the frame of our own competencies or capacities as a professional, the question of the responsibility as a citizen and the commitment or engagement within our world as a citizen, and the question of who designs the city. Is that the decision makers, the political decision makers? Is that the inhabitants who actually use the space and the design? Is that the architects who design? Is that the builder who actually changes what the architect has planned and built? Is that the regulator, the one who has decided on the planning regulations? My answer from my practice and from European alternatives would be is potentially none of them, but all of them together. And there's a question of how we co-create and how we take responsibility for the space we live in and the future we want to create. And that's where European Alternatives as an organization has started from. So it may sound far away from urban planning, but we started as an organization with something called London Festival of Europe. So at the couple of months from Brexit now, it may sound a bit crazy, but 10 years ago, we were a very small group of people. We started this festival thinking, well, everyone is talking about, well, not everyone, a few people are talking about Europe, something that takes a very growing importance in our lives, and what we think as an incredible potential. But who speaks about it? Technicians, political decision makers, the citizens are very little involved in this discussion, let alone the thinkers, the cultural actors, who are, in fact, were some of the basic minds behind what the idea of Europe may be. So I wanted to start this with this, saying like it's really European alternatives is really about enabling people throughout Europe. May they be alone, may they be communities, may they be already local activists, may they be in a city, but with a view of changing the way the society works and the way it is perceived, and enabling them to be heard more and to improve by exchanging with others, but also by co-creating actions that will have some impact. I will just take you through a tour of, I don't know how I go back to that. Yeah, okay. So as you know, I have to be honest and say that I have different hats, because I'm European Alternatives as an activist. I've been director, cultural director of this organization for like, I changed title. I'm really against titles anyway, but I've been with the organization for 10 years. And I'm also working, so I train as a political scientist and as an urban planner. And I've been working for a European program that puts together cities from throughout Europe to discuss about urban policies, also for a very long time. And this program is called URBACT. So that's my URBACT hat. And that's me for the moment. So I'm taking you to Macerata, which is disappeared again. Yeah. Okay. I'm taking you to Macerata, which is 4 hours away from here on a car. And actually they have made, and they have an incredible, a very nice practice there on regeneration of urban green spaces and co-management of the design of spaces with children. So it's a very small city, 43,000 inhabitants, and they had no money at all. But they decided to look in what was left in the storage places of the children's how it's called, nursery, and to involve children in thinking what would be the place, the space they would like to play in. And so they came so with recycled material, they came up with the ideas of building labyrinths and things that can evolve. And the reason I show that is that it's a very small city. They have no means, but they have been able to take the time to involve children in thinking the future of the space. And that's something that is very strong, in my opinion, in involving citizens in space design and management. It requires a lot of time. And I've learned that from different work on participation and practices. But if you don't do that, you face situations such as the one, you may know this situation in Belgrade, which there is a very strong movement called Don't Drown Belgrade. Basically, it's a very rich investor which bought one of the space that is close to the river. So there is the historic city that is not very close to the river. Well, it's not far, it's not that big, but there is not directly close to the river. And there was a space that was housing and that has been regenerated recently by cultural actors that have invested in spaces and so on. And so the municipality saw it like as a perfect place where you can make money and sell the space to a very good investor. And what did this very rich investor do? He bought an enormous plot of land. They moved the people of their housing. somehow by force during the night. And they asked Zaha Hadid to design a beautiful space. So that's where it comes like, what is the value of architecture? I mean, when do you do a very beautiful building? How does it connect within the city and with the community? And what happens in Belgrade is that there is a big movement of activists that has built up to protest against this development project. And this group of activists has also presented a list at the last municipal elections by saying like, well, we want to be a real alternative to the existing political system in place. As you may also know, Serbia is not a totally open democratic space. So the municipality list, for several reasons, didn't make it through. Contrary to what happened in different cities throughout Europe. And these are cities we've been working with. And you all remember the M25 movement in Spain. So like people occupying the space and saying and protesting against the government, against austerity, etc. And they have, as you know, created movements through Podemos that have taken power in Madrid, in Barcelona, in La Coruña, and in other cities throughout Spain. And these movements have also some very strong connection. I mean, there are similar movements in other cities throughout Europe, like Naples, Palermo, in Grenoble in France, and all the way to not the Czech Republic, not that I know, I maybe like very strong municipality, but I was going to Poland. I was moving to Poland, and Gdansk is a very interesting example of a municipality that really works with involving citizens in somehow adverse environment, because Poland has been like Polish political life has been hijacked by a party that is very autocratic and is actually eating up rights, as it happens in many different places. As well, we'll see how it goes in Italy. And so these municipalist movements are interesting for different reasons. One is that they propose to, I mean, it comes from citizens who say, well, we want to decide on our local life. We want to decide what's the cultural policy of the city will be. We want to, I mean, in Spain, as you know, in Barcelona, it started with, we don't want to be thrown out of our houses because banks own the houses. They all started with Ada Colau fighting against the eviction of citizens from their houses. And at the end, the city managed to kind of slow down the number of evictions. There are very interesting movements in our mind as European alternatives in that they try to find new ways to think the city and think living together. That said, they don't manage to do what they want. I mean, in Barcelona, for instance, they found themselves as the main people managing the city. But it's actually the national regulation that says who you can evict and when. So they didn't really have full hands on that. And in Madrid, for instance, and in Barcelona as well, both cities said we want to actually welcome refugees as places. We want to welcome all the refugees that are trying to ask asylum and help in Europe, but it's the national regulation, the national countries that decide on that. And that's another point that is very interesting for us as European alternatives, is that if local, as strong as local movements may be, as strong as a group that can develop on local policies, they still find themselves alone, stuck by the national level or some other forces and regulators. And something we try to do is to put them all together to work together. Yeah, okay, I should. And to and to be able to claim for different rights with the help of other people that are not in the same place. And I wanted to take you to Romania, to Cluj-Napoca, on a topic that you may have heard about, and I would be interested to know what you have, if you have any discussion about it. Cluj-Napoca is, I will look for it because it's not so. Have you heard of the question of the commons? Is that something you have discussed in your? Can someone tell me what the commons are? Commons. Well, actually, I don't mean like common people. And has someone heard of the rights to the city? You know. Sorry, you know, yeah, of course. But you can come in, Seba. No, but of course, come in. But you knew the rights to the city? Or comments?
I'm not sure if I mix up things. I mean, the question of the commons reminds me of a topic we've been talking in public economics class in Milan about how a society tends to over exploit commonly owned goods, and unless there are certain restrictions, and I think there has been research done in small valleys in the Alps and in very old communities that are able to sustain common property for a very long time without owning it. But in most part of the world, it's not so easy to establish this. Maybe that's something else.
No, it's part of it totally. Selva, you want to? Because the idea of the commons comes from the UK, actually, surprisingly, is that there were in all cities fields that were commonly used by all the peasants, and that they could leave their cattle eat there, and it is a space that is commonly used and commonly owned and commonly managed. So in that sense, the commons, they can be somehow public space, which is commonly used and commonly owned through different entities. It can be the air that is common to the whole humanity and can be polluted. So that's what you are talking about, the externalities of a flight polluting an air that is commonly used and nobody paying for it, actually. It can be water that is owned, like a river, the sea, that should be owned by everyone and can actually be managed by everyone. And it can expand to different things. Sorry? Like data. Yeah. There is a discussion like how it's public, how it's commonly used, how it's commonly produced, and how it can then be privatized and be created as a space for conflict when someone comes in and privatizes something, makes money out of it, and takes it away from the use of the others. The reasons I'm mentioning the commons is that it's something that has grown a lot in political discussions of activist movements throughout the world, and throughout Europe. And I was coming to Cluj-Napoca because they have beautiful hills. I don't know if you know anything about Romania. It's a very beautiful country, and they have wonderful hills. That's where the hills where you could think of Dracula being there, Transylvania. And these hills used to be gold mining hills a long time ago. But the gold mines have stopped. And these hills also have gas in it. So there was a Canadian company that had bought the hills close to Cluj-Napoca and wanted to destroy them. So destroy the heritage of the gold mining tunnel being there, destroy the environment of all the peasants who were in those hills, and privatize the resources to sell them away to different people, like the gas, and destroy the hills, because you know the whole discussion about the different way of extracting gas. And the people of Cluj-Napoca and of these hills had been fighting for a long time locally to counter this development. But, and it's a time where we were we're still very involved in the commons discussion, but at a time where we try to link up the movements that are fighting for the commons throughout Europe. So for instance, there was Naples, which is quite strong on the commons, on the water. I mean, they remunicipalized water, the use of water, and they created a charter of the commons, of the space that are commonly used and commonly managed by the citizens. They had links with people in, let me think, fighting on the commons in Germany, in France, I mean, all throughout Europe. And those people managed to go internationally to, also to the European Parliament. They created they created an institutional system in the European Parliaments to have a discussion on the commons. And with all these kind of international pressure, and for also many other reasons, you always know you're only one part of a movement. I mean, I'm not saying that European alternatives has been the hand behind it. I mean, those people locally have been fought for it for ages. But thanks to all this networking and common activity, they managed to have the Canadian company go out and the project being forgotten. And that's one of the things that European alternatives do, putting people together, giving them a stage during the festivals, giving some international exposure, raising our hands when we think something is incredibly frightening. So we have different type of activities, but I wanted to mention those ones. And so we're working now on this program that is called Cities of Change, and in which you can find things on the right to the city and the different movements that exist, and all these kind of conflicts that exist around the use of space, and all the new ways that people have developed to co-involve the other citizens in thinking the space. And the reason I wanted to really insist on this part of our activity is that it's really related to space, and it's somewhere where architects have an agency, and they have an agency in the way they conceive the use of space, in the way they think about the processes that allow for a building to happen. And yep. If you have any question, yeah, Salva.
Sorry. Some relatively kind of dumb number questions, because I think it's super interesting to know that it's actually a group of youngsters 10 years ago who decided to set up European alternatives. And so how many are you now? Like, what's your annual budget? How do you get your money? Because that's some of these dreams. I think what the question that you asked, what's the role of the agency of the architect or not? I mean, it's not about any profession in a way, but it's about like the moment you want to stop having a client. So that, because something you care about deeply, is beyond any client, that a client won't come to you with that project, but you want to do it. So then what do? How do you actually, how do you transform it into a real project? And I think that it would be a very useful thing to hear from you.
Okay, so European Alternatives started with 2-3 people at the very beginning in 2007 with no money. So the first festival, nobody was paid. I think the whole festival, it was a 10 days of events, had a budget of 2,000 euros. I mean, it was incredible. And now we are like 10, 12, I mean, it depends on, there are people who are full-time and some who are only part-time, spread throughout 3 offices throughout Europe, in Berlin, Rome, and Paris mostly, with some operations in London, but it's becoming complicated. And the annual budget is, we have a turnover of like 600,000 euros now. So it's not a huge budget, but it's quite a considerable budget, and it allows us to do quite a lot. And it was created by like people who were 23 and who just had this idea that something should be done in Europe. And I must say that, I mean, Selva has found out about the organizations through Al Jazeera. Recently, Nicolo, my husband, and Lorenzo, who had written the Al Jazeera article, they published a book and in the UK, but it's going to be published in Germany, and that we found out that in the frame of 10 years, what we thought was a very, I mean, it's still a very minority discourse. I'm not saying that everyone thinks that culture should be at the center of rethinking Europe, and that probably austerity is not the best way to deal with citizens' rights. But there has been an enormous space that we have been able to, I don't know if it was feeding, maybe we were coming at the moment where people were able to hear something we had to say. And so a word that we've been using since the beginning is transnational. Many people still don't understand it, but we were using it 10 years ago, and like people were looking at us like, what are you talking about? Transnational space, the possibility to have agency in a transnational level, transnational lists, political, like people who would go to vote in lists for parliament that are not linked to a nation, but are linked to a transnational space. Like really people thought we were aliens, and now is really in the discourse. I mean, everyone is using that word. Again, I don't think it's thanks to us. It's come to, at the moment where the space was happening for this word to spread, and there were many others who were using it. The commons I mentioned, we worked a lot on it. Now there is a group composed within the European Parliament on the commons, and there is a commons assembly, so like people all throughout Europe that have composed themselves as a perpetual assembly. So there's is way beyond your question, sorry. But yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I find it very interesting. I like this term transnational, and I think it's very useful. And at the same time, in the recent years, I have the feeling that there's a revival in Europe of regional patriotism. I mean, not only nationalism, which is like a strong, weird comeback of something else, but I think this political activism on a smaller scale, on a city scale, which is, I think, often better in organizing itself as an opposition because it's small, it's localized, and I find it often quite linked to a sense of regional belonging, for example, in the case of Barcelona. And I was wondering how, I mean, if you see this as well, and if there is a shift from like identifying yourself through a nationality, which is really I mean, an old-fashioned but also very abstract concept to a regional identity, and if this is something bad or good, or yeah.
Yeah, so yes, it's a discussion we've had a lot, like what is local and how to go beyond localism, regional identity or local identity, and how you can take people and show that you can work together and that the space is not composed of your city. Because if you look at your neighborhood, well, maybe you'll be able to change the way your local park is designed, but you're not going to be able to change the housing policy that's make it so that your neighbor is evicted because it's decided at the national level, and it's even not decided at the national level because it happens because there has been a financial crash and the banks have to take up their money. But anyways, so that's a question that is really strong in our work. On the case of Barcelona, like Catalan independence, Ada Colau and the municipalist movement in the city of Barcelona are not in the same line than the Catalyst nationalists. So it doesn't really mean municipalism. It doesn't really mean closed idea of what your space of belonging is. Actually, it's one of the cities that has been leading network of cities within Spain and like trying to have international exposure and also to counteract these things. So to answer your question, yes, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's very difficult for me because as you can imagine, when you see the results of the elections in Italy, in Slovenia, in Austria, in France, I don't know what happened, but we have been sieged for five years for the moment. But it's very worrying to see the rise of the political discourse that is one that is of rejection, exclusion, nationalism. And what we're trying as an organization to promote is that Europe doesn't mean losing its identity. Europe, if it's thought differently, can also mean having more power as citizens. And it's not by, well, if I take the very basic example of the UK, going out of Europe, I mean, nobody knows yet what the real impact will be on the poorest population in Britain, on those who don't have the means to have another citizenship, or on those who don't have the means to travel that easily, or to study abroad, even if they don't have access to the European exchange system. But for the moment, it looks like not very good. So looking inward is not necessarily something that will help people to have more agency of their lives. And like Brexit take back control sounds very ironic in my view at the moment, because it doesn't look like those who wanted to take back control will have it. What we see is that it's a very conservative government that says that the most important thing in the country is the health insurance and the health system, and it actually cuts all the expenditures of the health system and destroys the health system. So what the people who, like what people get in return from their vote is not very clear. Yes, that's something, yeah, that's part of it. But we do a lot of fun things, and like the festival is a fun moment. Like we're trying to, not to be dramatic and say, oh, there is no hope, and not to be over idealist and say everything should be hope. We're saying like we have the right, and that's where our name comes from. I mean, actually, our name was European Alterities at the very beginning, but nobody understood because it comes from French. It wasn't even invented by a French. I mean, you hear me speaking, you think it's French, but no, it was by two other people. But alterities, like the other, openness to the other, was a bit too difficult to grasp. So it moved to alternatives. And we've been trying to show that there are different ways that are possible, and that is not, there is not only one way, and that is not because people tell you there is no other alternative. That is true, and that as an individual, we have the right to claim other options and to construct them, even if they are not perfect, even if they are not finalized. Yeah. Sorry, that was too long. Thank you.